When Rachel's husband begged her to divorce him and marry his best friend instead, she thought he'd lost his mind. But the truth behind his desperate plan was far more twisted than she could ever imagine. What she discovered would change 3 lives forever, and it all started with a single phone call. Before we dive into Rachel's unbelievable story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that'll leave you speechless. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this one ends. Now let's get started. Rachel Thompson had always believed in fairy tales, at least the realistic kind. At 34, she lived in a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn with her husband Michael, worked as a senior marketing executive at a firm she loved, and maintained friendships that felt more like family. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, built brick by brick through hard work and dedication. She and Michael had been together since they were 19, childhood sweethearts who grew up in the same neighborhood, attending the same church, dreaming the same dreams. They got married young at 26, and for 8 years their relationship had been the kind that made other couples jealous. Michael worked as an investment banker, the kind of job that came with long hours and even longer stress levels. He was charming and ambitious, always chasing the next big deal, the next promotion, the next milestone. Rachel admired his drive even when it meant lonely evenings and postponed vacation plans. They didn't have children yet, both agreeing to focus on their careers first, to build the kind of financial foundation that would give their future family everything they needed. Then there was Stephen Harris, Michael's best friend since their college days. Stephen was as much a part of their lives as their morning coffee routine. He joined them for weekly dinners, accompanied them on vacations, and filled their home with laughter during holidays. He was successful in his own right, working in finance like Michael, but he came from old money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. Stephen had never married, and while he dated occasionally, nothing ever seemed to stick. He played the perpetual third wheel with grace, never making things awkward, always knowing when to give the couple space and when his presence was welcome. Everything changed on a Tuesday evening in March. Rachel had noticed Michael becoming increasingly distant over the past few weeks. He was working later than usual, barely touching his dinner, losing weight in a way that made his suits hang loose on his frame. When she tried to talk to him about it, he'd brush her off with vague mentions of a stressful project at work. Rachel, ever the supportive wife, decided to give him space to work through whatever was bothering him. She convinced herself it was just a phase, that the man she loved would come back to her once the pressure eased. That Tuesday, Michael came home early. His eyes were red and swollen, his hands trembling as he asked Rachel to sit down. The tone of his voice made her stomach drop. She'd never seen him like this, not even when his father passed away 5 years ago. He could barely get the words out, his voice breaking with every syllable. And then he said it, the words that would shatter her entire world. "I need you to divorce me and marry Stephen." Rachel's first reaction was to laugh. It had to be a joke, some weird prank that Michael and Stephen had cooked up. But Michael wasn't laughing. Tears were streaming down his face, and his whole body shook with the weight of what he'd just asked. The laughter died in Rachel's throat, replaced by a cold fury that spread through her veins like ice water. She demanded an explanation, her voice rising with each question. What kind of sick game was this? Had he lost his mind? Did he think she was some kind of property to be passed around between friends? Michael collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands, and the truth came spilling out. He was in debt, massive, crushing debt, to the tune of $4.7 million. He'd made terrible investment decisions, the kind that investment bankers warn their clients against. He'd gotten cocky, convinced he could predict the market, and when things went south, he'd borrowed money from the wrong people to cover his losses. Not banks or legitimate lenders, but loan sharks, the kind of people who made threats that weren't empty. They'd given him 2 weeks to come up with the money, or they would kill him. He'd already exhausted every legal option, sold everything he could, begged every contact in his network. There was nothing left. Rachel felt like she was drowning. The man sitting in front of her seemed like a stranger. How had he hidden this from her? How had things gotten this bad without her knowing? But before she could process any of it, Stephen arrived at their door. Apparently, this conversation had been planned, coordinated like one of their business deals. Stephen looked almost as miserable as Michael, but there was a determination in his eyes that Rachel had never seen before. The plan, as insane as it sounded, had a certain twisted logic to it. Stephen came from generational wealth, the kind that came with trust funds and inheritance clauses. His grandfather had set up a massive trust that would pay out $15 million, but only if Stephen was married by the time he turned 40. Stephen was turning 40 in 3 months. He'd never found the right person, never felt pressured to marry just for money, but now his best friend's life hung in the balance. If Rachel agreed to marry Stephen, he would get access to the trust fund. He would then give Michael the money needed to pay off the loan sharks and save his life. After 2 years, the minimum time required to avoid legal scrutiny, Rachel and Stephen would divorce quietly. They'd split whatever money remained after paying off Michael's debts and legal fees. Everyone would get what they needed. Michael would live, Stephen would secure his inheritance, and Rachel would walk away financially secure. Rachel listened to this proposal with growing disbelief. They'd actually planned this, worked out the details, discussed her like she was a chess piece to be moved around the board. Stephen was quick to assure her that it would be purely a business arrangement. They would live together to make it look legitimate, but in separate bedrooms with absolutely no expectations of a physical relationship. He promised to respect her boundaries completely. Michael, still crying, got down on his knees and begged. These people would kill him, he insisted. They'd already made threats, shown up at his office, followed him home. He had 1 week left before the deadline. He knew he had no right to ask this of her, knew it was insane, but he was desperate. Rachel threw them both out of her house that night. The audacity of these men thinking they could arrange her life like a business transaction was beyond comprehension. She felt like property, like she had no value beyond her ability to solve their problems. That night she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except the absolute insanity of what they'd proposed. But in the quiet hours of the morning, doubt crept in. She started looking into Michael's claims, searching through his laptop when he wasn't home, checking his phone records. What she found terrified her. The threatening text messages were real. The loan documents were real. The photos of Michael taken from a distance, clearly surveillance shots, were real. He hadn't been lying about the danger. These people were serious, and they would follow through on their threats. Then came the night that changed everything. Michael came home covered in blood, his face swollen and bruised, his ribs cracked. The loan sharks had sent a message, a preview of what would happen if he didn't pay. Rachel rushed him to the emergency room, lying to the doctors about a mugging. As she sat in that sterile waiting room watching her husband of 8 years get stitched up, she made a decision she never thought she'd make. She agreed, but not without conditions. Everything would be put in writing by lawyers. She and Stephen would maintain separate bedrooms with no physical relationship whatsoever. Michael would not date anyone during the 2-year arrangement, a condition that seemed only fair given what he was asking of her. And after she divorced Stephen and this nightmare ended, she wanted time apart from Michael. If they were ever going to reconcile, it would be on her terms, after she'd had time to process the betrayal of being asked to marry another man. Both men agreed to everything without hesitation. The machinery of divorce ground into motion with shocking speed. Rachel and Michael stood in a courthouse on a gray Monday morning and dissolved 8 years of marriage in less than 30 minutes. Rachel signed the papers with tears streaming down her face, feeling like she was watching her own life from outside her body. 1 week later, she stood in the same courthouse and married Stephen Harris. There was no white dress, no flowers, no family, just signatures and witnesses and the weight of a lie that would last 2 years. Moving into Stephen's penthouse felt surreal. The apartment was beautiful, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture, but it wasn't home. That first night, they stood in the hallway, both uncertain of what to do next. Stephen showed her to the guest bedroom he'd prepared, assured her that he would respect her privacy, and wished her good night. Rachel lay awake in a stranger's home, wearing a stranger's ring, wondering how her life had become unrecognizable in the span of 3 weeks. The first few months were awkward beyond measure. They had to appear as a real couple in public, attending charity events and dinners with Stephen's family. His mother, Louise, was overjoyed that her son had finally settled down, constantly gushing about what beautiful grandchildren they would have. Every compliment felt like a knife in Rachel's gut. She was living a lie, deceiving good people, all to save a man who had put her in this position in the first place. But something unexpected happened as the weeks turned into months. Rachel and Stephen actually became friends, real friends. They'd known each other for years, but always with Michael as the buffer between them. Now, living in close quarters, they discovered things about each other they'd never known. Stephen was an incredible cook who made breakfast every Sunday. Rachel was a terrible singer who belted out off-key songs in the shower. They stayed up late talking about everything from philosophy to trash TV, developing inside jokes and comfortable silences. Stephen was kind in ways that surprised her. He remembered how she liked her coffee, asked about her work presentations, and gave her space when she needed it. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never made her feel uncomfortable or obligated. And slowly, Rachel began to see him differently. Not as Michael's friend or as the solution to a crisis, but as a man in his own right. A good man who made her laugh, who listened when she spoke, who treated her with a respect she hadn't even realized had been missing from her marriage. It was around the 6-month mark when Stephen admitted something that changed everything. They were sitting on the balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights, when he confessed that he'd always had feelings for her. From the moment Michael had introduced them in college, Stephen had been drawn to her, but she was Michael's girlfriend, then Michael's fiancée, then Michael's wife, and Stephen had never acted on those feelings out of respect for their relationship. He'd played the good friend, the supportive third wheel, while quietly nursing an unrequited love for years. Rachel didn't know what to say. She'd never suspected, never noticed the way Stephen looked at her or the careful distance he maintained. But now, hearing it spoken aloud, she realized that her own feelings had shifted too. Somewhere between the late-night conversations and the shared laughter, she'd started falling for Stephen. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. Meanwhile, Michael was unraveling. He'd gotten his money, paid off his debts, and should have been relieved. Instead, he showed up at the penthouse unannounced, often drunk, always angry. He accused Rachel of betraying him, of falling in love with Stephen, of forgetting about their marriage. The irony was almost laughable. He was the one who had forced this situation, who had essentially sold his wife to save his own skin, and now he was jealous that the arrangement he'd created had consequences he hadn't anticipated. One night, after a particularly volatile confrontation where Michael had screamed at both of them, Rachel snapped. For the first time in their relationship, she stood up to him fully, without holding back. He'd created this situation, she reminded him. He'd asked her to marry another man, to live with another man, to pretend to be another man's wife. He didn't get to show up and act like a wronged husband when he was the architect of his own suffering. She ordered him to leave and told him not to come back until he could behave like an adult. But the real bombshell came 2 weeks later. Stephen had been quiet since the confrontation, clearly wrestling with something heavy. Finally, over dinner, he told Rachel the truth, the whole truth. The trust fund clause was real, he hadn't lied about that. But Michael had known about Stephen's feelings for Rachel. Stephen had confessed them years ago, in a moment of weakness, and Michael had thrown it in his face during an argument. More than that, Michael had been having an affair during the last year of his marriage to Rachel. A woman from his office, someone Rachel had met at company parties and smiled at without knowing she was sleeping with her husband. Michael had wanted out of the marriage but needed the money from Stephen's trust fund to cover his debts, so he'd manipulated them both, using the threat to his life as leverage while failing to mention that he'd already checked out of his marriage emotionally. Stephen had proof, emails, and text messages that painted a damning picture of a man who'd been playing both sides. Rachel felt like she'd been punched in the chest. The betrayal was complete now, the full picture finally visible. She'd sacrificed 2 years of her life, her dignity, her sense of self, to save a man who'd already betrayed her. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the rage, and underneath it all was a strange sense of liberation. She didn't owe Michael anything anymore. The guilt she'd been carrying, the sense that she was betraying her marriage by developing feelings for Stephen, evaporated like morning fog. She and Stephen confronted Michael together, presenting the evidence like prosecutors at trial. Michael tried to deny it at first, then made excuses, then finally broke down and admitted everything. The affair, the manipulation, the way he'd used Stephen's feelings for Rachel as a tool to get what he wanted. He was pathetic and small, nothing like the man Rachel had married. She told him she wanted nothing to do with him ever again. Stephen, who'd been Michael's friend for over 15 years, cut him off completely. The friendship was over, the trust obliterated beyond repair. Rachel filed for legal separation from Michael, making it clear that there would be no reconciliation, no second chances. That chapter of her life was closed permanently, but the chapter with Stephen, that was just beginning. They decided to stay married, not because of money or obligation or any external pressure, but because they'd genuinely fallen in love. They started their relationship over from the beginning, going on proper dates, learning about each other without the shadow of the arrangement hanging over them. Their first real kiss happened on a rooftop under the stars, and it felt like coming home. Stephen promised her that he would spend every day earning her trust, proving that he was nothing like Michael, showing her what real partnership looked like, and he kept that promise. 2 years after their courthouse wedding, they renewed their vows in a real ceremony, surrounded by friends and family who knew the whole messy truth and loved them anyway. Rachel wore white this time, and when she walked down the aisle, there were happy tears instead of devastated ones. A year later, Rachel stood in the nursery of their penthouse, one hand on her growing belly, the other held by Stephen. They were expecting a daughter, a baby girl who would grow up knowing that love could be complicated and messy, but ultimately worth fighting for. Rachel had advanced in her career, now a vice president at her firm, with Stephen supporting every promotion and late-night and ambitious goal. He'd meant what he said about partnership. Michael tried to reach out a few times, through mutual acquaintances and apologetic emails, but Rachel and Stephen blocked him from their lives completely. Some people didn't deserve second chances, and some doors once closed should stay that way. Rachel had learned that sometimes the wrong path leads you exactly where you need to be. She'd lost a husband but found a real partner. She'd been forced into an impossible situation but discovered what genuine love actually felt like. Her story became a quiet legend among their friends, a reminder that life rarely goes according to plan, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the strangest packages. Rachel had thought her fairy tale ended in that courthouse when she divorced Michael. What she didn't know then was that it was really just beginning. Rachel's story shows us that sometimes life takes the strangest turns to bring us exactly where we need to be. What would you have done in Rachel's position? Let me know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life stories that prove truth is stranger than fiction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.